Guys, welcome to session 5 of Putting Sin to Death. What I want us to do today is I want us to think about how to enlist in what I would call the war against sin. Maybe you've read The Lord of the Rings or you've watched the movies, and you remember that place called the Shire, where the hobbits live. And the thing about the hobbits is really they don't care what's happening outside their little realm. If they can grow their potatoes and have beautiful little gardens, then what's going on elsewhere, no matter how dark it gets, it's kind of off their grid and out of their thinking, and even away from their concern. And I think that's how we often are with our sin. We kind of want to put sin to death insofar as it's a hindrance or a source of discomfort within our own lives. But what we don't really appreciate is that this is all about something much bigger than me. It's about something even bigger than my own eternal future, in my own sanctification. That I'm born into a kind of war, and God, He's located me and assigned me to deal with my sin, but it's part of a much bigger issue and a much bigger campaign that He is leading. And so what I mean by the war against sin is I want us to be thinking, how do we actually go beyond just thinking about me putting my own sin to death, to ultimately me being a faithful worker, a faithful soldier, extending the bigger mission of God in this world. And the way I want to do this, if you have a Bible, I want to use Matthew 5, and I want to think about what are often called the Beatitudes, the very first thing that Jesus says in His famous Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to think of these as kind of stages in this battle of how we ultimately really take on the responsibility that God wants to be putting sin to death, but even going beyond that and doing something more. So what is the first beatitude? The first beatitude is this: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What I want you to know is stage 1 of entering into this war is embracing humility, even embracing humiliation. Men, we hate anything that eats on our sense of self-worth. We avoid and resist humiliation at all cost. There's a famous combat historian named S.L. Marshall. And in one of his books, he said, personal honor is the one thing valued more than life itself by the majority of men. We want to have honor and dignity in the eyes of others, and we are willing to do whatever it takes, even deceive ourselves, in order to have that sense of respect. Now, the only way we can begin to really deal with sin is not really even being humiliated. It's really just coming to see ourselves accurately. We have to recognize that all of this front of strength, it's just a game that we're playing. That actually we're not nearly as strong as we project ourselves to be. It takes an Oreo on a table to cause our self-control to wilt. It takes a woman walking across the street in a short skirt for the dam of self-control to burst and all of that lust to flood out. Humility, as defined by the greatest Christian minds, is really nothing more than an accurate view of oneself. Here's what Walter Hilton said. He said, "He is truly humble who truthfully knows and is conscious of himself as he actually is." This is what William Law said. Humility does not consist in having a worse opinion of ourselves than we deserve, or in abasing ourselves lower than we really are. Humility is founded in truth. It is founded in a true and just sense of our weakness, our misery, and our sin. And guys, the way this war begins, stage 1 is just realizing that we have no strength to begin with. And not trying to hide that fact, but embracing that fact. And taking it and saying, God, I need you. I need you to begin this process. I need you to continue this process. All of my feeble attempts are worth nothing. If you've read the book of Judges, there's that cycle that goes on and on in the history of Israel. In Israel, they fall into bondage. They succumb to the nations around them, and end up toiling. And when is the moment where everything changes? It often takes them years to get to this place. It's when they simply realize they're weak, they can't do it, and finally they call out with a humble heart to God, asking for mercy and for grace. That's stage one of this war. Here's stage two. Stage two. Let's look at the second beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn. Now, why is mourning, why is grief such an important sign in this war against sin? Maybe you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that first Narnia book. And you remember that Narnia was suffering due to an endless winter. And when there started to be rumors that Aslan is on the move again, there's this moment where the witch and her dwarf and Edmund, who she's captured, they're trying to get to the stone table before Aslan and any of his crew get there. And all of a sudden the sleigh starts to have trouble because they notice there's a thaw. And when the Holy Spirit begins to grow active in our hearts, what happens is a kind of thaw. That all of a sudden, it's not drops of ice that are melting, it's rather the hardness of our hearts that's melting, and it produces tears in our eyes. Because all of a sudden, the world that we thought was so glaringly attractive, in which we were so earnestly trying to make our way and establish ourselves as having value among our peers, instead of seeing all the light and the glamour and the glitz, we see the brokenness of sin. The psalmist says that, tears flow down his eyes, Psalm 119, verse 136, as he sees the way that God's commandments are broken. Jesus stood before Jerusalem and he wept like Jeremiah wept, there looking at God's people, the brokenness, the sin within even the church. And of course, any guy that looks honestly at his own life and at the collateral damage evident in his kids and in his marriage and in his workplace due to his own sin, what happens? There's weeping, there's mourning, there's a real pain. Martin Luther, on these verses, this is what he said. He said, "For you must not think that mourning means only weeping and lamenting or wailing like children. For it is not yet real deep grief. If it has found its way to the heart and pours itself out through the eyes. Real grief is when hard blows come that strike and crush the heart so that one cannot weep or dare complain to anyone." Guys, stage two is when your eyes begin to open and you see just how big the problem of sin is. That it has reaped destruction and disintegration within the cosmos, the world around us, within society, in the town or city in which you live, within your family and your parents and your grandparents and your kids. You see it everywhere, and whether the tears flow or not, there's just this agonizing pain as you see that I've participated in this. Now that leads us to stage three. Stage three, I think in a way mirrors the third beatitude. Blessed are the meek. Now what is meekness? I've heard one person say meekness is carrying a sword but keeping it sheathed. And it is. It's subdued strength. Meekness is what was characteristic in the old world of a war horse, who had all of the strength of a horse, but rather than allow its instinct, which would cause it to flee the noise and the chaos of battle, it would subdue that and be able to stand its ground. Meekness is what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, the ability that when you're struck in the cheek, you don't strike back, but your motive in not doing so is not cowardice, it's commandment. Jesus has told you not to. Now, why is meekness so vital in this war against sin? What you need to realize, any man who begins to put a stop to the agenda of sin in his life will face the wrath of hell. Satan will be furious. If you've read Pilgrim Progress, you remember that Christian, after he'd spent the night in that house and he'd slept in the chamber of peace and he's given the armor, then he's led down into the valley of humility, thinking that maybe the worst of his trials are over. And just around the corner there is standing Apollyon, out to kill him because he's now resisting lordship, the lordship of the devil in his life. Guys, there's no resistance when you swim downstream. It's when you turn and face the current. And it's the same with sin. As long as you give sin free rein, it will not offer any furious resistance. It's when you begin to say no that it flares its ugly head and begins to do everything it can to exert its former lordship over you again. John Owen, who wrote a classic book on putting sin to death, this is how he describes the reaction of indwelling sin when we begin to try to mortify it. He says, as a man nailed to the cross, he first struggles and strives and cries out with great strength and might. But as his blood and spirit waste away, his strivings are faint and seldom. That first blow to sin, it agonizes, it gets angry, it exerts all of its strength fiercely to dominate you. But guys, if we persist, it begins to wane and lose some of the vigor. There's a verse, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4. We often think of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 about keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, running the race. But notice what verse 4 says. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. Guys, stage 4 is in the trenches. Just trying to endure with meekness, with patience, and to not give ground. Remember, Christian in Pilgrim's Progress is given no armor for his back. You can't turn. You just try to hold fast as those fiery darts are aimed toward you. Now this leads to stage 4. What is the fourth beatitude? Blessed are those who hunger and who thirst for righteousness. Guys, stage 4 is when we begin to crave righteousness. Have you ever had the pain, the nagging pain of thirst or hunger? I was reading a memoir by Louis L'Amour, the famous Western writer, talking about his early life. This is the Great Depression. He took a job down in Arizona, and he's driving a Model T, which at that time was already obsolete, and it breaks down in the middle of the Arizona desert in the summer. And he's got like 30 or 40 miles to walk. No water. And he describes the thirst. He describes putting stones in his mouth, just trying to do something to diminish the agony of desiring water, his need for water. Now, guys, how many men have felt those kind of pangs for righteousness? When you are starving, when you are hungry, when you've not even eaten for a few days, maybe you've skipped a meal, you can't get your hunger off your mind. And stage 4 of putting sin to death is when you can't get righteousness off your mind. It's what you dwell upon. It's where all of a sudden you begin to obsess about wanting God's holiness to be advanced, sin to be diminished. And what's so wonderful about these pangs is they're a sign of real spiritual strength emerging in the soul of a man. It's a little bit like if you remember the story of Samson, where all of a sudden after he's been captured by the Philistines, they've shaved his head. We read that the hair begins to grow again, that his strength is beginning to be regained. And when we begin to thirst and hunger for righteousness, it's that sign. This is where all of a sudden our spiritual DNA is being activated again. And I think what happens at this stage in a man's growth is he begins to think less of what he needs to put off, and he begins to think more of what he needs to put on. So maybe you've noticed that Paul, again and again, he talks about putting off and putting on. And these things, they kind of go together, but often, initially, as Christians, our emphasis is what we've got to be putting off. I need to stop lusting. I need to stop being greedy. I need to stop being proud. But there comes a time when you begin to think, yes, you still got to put these things off, but what you really want is not so much lust to go away. You want purity of heart. You don't so much want to stop being greedy. You want contentment. You want generosity. You don't want to not be cowardly. You want to be courageous. And that begins to be your focus. Let me read you some verses from Romans chapter 13, verse 11 down to 14. And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awaken out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness. Let us put on the armor of life. Let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry, not in drunkenness, not in lewdness, not in lust, not in strife, not in envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And make no provision for the flesh. I read an old biography of St. Francis of Assisi, written by another wonderful old Christian, St. Bonaventure. And this is how Bonaventure describes the passion that drove Francis's life. I thought this is compelling. He said, as long as Francis lived, this was his supreme philosophy. This his supreme desire. To inquire from the wise and the simple, the perfect and the imperfect, the young and the old, how he could more effectively reach the summit of perfection. This is not him trying to be self-righteous. He just wanted to know how to be more like his Jesus. And friends, that's when we're craving righteousness. Now this leads to the fifth beatitude, which I think mirrors again the fifth stage of this war on sin. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Have you ever thought about what's distinctive about this beatitude? It's kind of a shift of gears in some ways. And what it does that the others had not done is it gives us something practical to do. And I think what that triggers in my thinking in terms of this topic of putting sin to death is we need to reach a point where we are deliberately practicing the virtues or the fruits of the Spirit that we are called to. True mortification is not just putting sin to death. Something must replace the vice that is being exterminated, and that is a virtue. So ultimately, putting sin to death is replacing a vice with a virtue. So instead of pride, you can't not view yourself in one way or another, so you can't have a vacuum. So if pride is going to be extinguished, something must replace it, and what replaces it is a right view of yourself, which causes humility. We can think of other examples. Again, instead of gluttony, well, you need self-control to replace it. Again, instead of greed, you need contentment. And the way that these fruits of the Spirit, the way that they grow is they grow through practice. We sometimes act as if there is a deficit of grace. If we're not growing spiritually, the problem is not on the supply end. God has given us all that we need. The grace is available to us. Often we're just leaving it at the table when we ought to be acting on the faith that God is supplying us the strength we need to grow into the men He wants us to become. Here's something that J.I. Packer said in a book on the Holy Spirit that I think guys in contemporary church culture, they need to think hard about this. A lot of us, we react against any call to exert effort in our spiritual lives. We're afraid that it's just going to produce self-righteousness. But listen to what Packer says. By the Spirit's enabling, a Christian resolves to do particular things that are right, and he actually does them. And thus he forms habits of doing right things, and out of these habits come character that is right. Habit forming is the Spirit's ordinary way of leading us on in holiness. Holiness by habit forming is not self-sanctification by self-effort. It is simply a matter of understanding the Spirit's method and keeping in step with the Spirit. Now, any guys who've been out there and tried to break bad habits and inculcate good habits, there's how difficult that process is, how much effort is required. And what we need to see is that, as we begin to crave for righteousness, it's not enough just to have the desire. It's not just a matter of the affections. It's also a matter of the will. It's also a matter of putting into practice what we are called to be. Now this leads to the sixth stage, which mirrors in my mind the sixth beatitude. Blessed are the poor, not the poor, blessed are the pure in heart. And so at this stage, what we are seeking is to purify our hearts. And what is a pure heart? Again, I recall an old, wonderful Christian, died many centuries ago, but who described there being 4 stages of love. You could almost think of these as 4 different gears that love can be switched between. The first one is love of self. That's what every person has in common, Christian and non-Christian alike. The unconverted person loves himself. So we don't need to think much about that. But here's the second gear of love. It is when you begin to love God for the sake of self. So this is what happens to a lot of people when they become Christians. Well, why do they want to respond favorably to the gospel? Well, they want a get out of jail card to get them out of hell. They want their sin to be forgiven. They love God for what he can do for them. And again, that might be enough to initially get them out of the world into the church. But we need to think above that. There's a third level or a third gear of love. And this is where we begin to love God for the sake of God. So we begin to realize that he's good, he's worthy of our worship, not simply because of what he does for us, but actually take us out of the equation, just who he is, his character, his attributes, his divinity, meaning that he has worth and value, even beauty, that ought to be worshipped. And that's a higher level of love to attain. But there's a fourth level or gear that this writer spoke of. And this is when you begin to love self for the sake of God. You see, the problem when you just love God for the sake of God is possible for him to exist in this sphere and me to exist in this sphere. But all of a sudden, what happens is you realize that actually the only value that the self has is insofar as it can promote, uphold, appreciate the infinite goodness that is God himself. So now I love myself for the sake of God. What I want for myself is that I can just be a vehicle, a channel, a mirror, so that he can be preeminent in everything. And friends, when you begin to think that way, that's a mark of a pure heart. When I think of a pure heart, I often think of George Whitefield. He was the first really mass preacher. He was the first guy to have the tens of thousands of people gather to hear him. He spoke to the largest crowds that had ever assembled anywhere apart from the battlefield. And toward the end of his life, as he was such a celebrity, not just within the church but around the world, these were the kinds of things that he said. He said, "Let the name of Whitefield perish. Let Christ be glorified. Let my name die everywhere. Let even my friends forget me, if by that means the cause of the blessed Jesus may be promoted." But what is Calvin? What is Luther? Let us look above names and parties. Let Jesus be our all in all, so that he is preached. I care not who is uppermost. I know my place, to be the servant of all. And I love this. This is what he wanted on his gravestone. I am content to wait till the judgment day for the clearing up of my reputation. And after I am dead, I desire no other epitaph than this. Here lies G.W. What sort of man he was, the great day will discover. There's a man who had a pure heart. Now, what is the seventh stage of this war against sin? Here I would combine really the next two beatitudes. Sometimes the last one spoken of more as a benediction. But first, blessed are the peacemakers. The seventh stage is when we begin to be an agent of peace. And what kind of peace is Jesus referring to here? This is not just a lack of conflict between parties. This is what is captured by that word that some of you have heard, that Hebrew word shalom, where everything finally is able to have its place in a way that honors and reveals the goodness of God. Guys, what does it take for us to begin to be agents of bringing God's peace, His righteousness to this world? It takes us dealing with our own sin. And as our sin begins to be put to death, as we begin to be transformed, then we're able to begin to bring some transformation to the world around us. You know, we sometimes miss the fact when Jesus talks about the plank in the eye and the speck in the brother's eye, we sometimes act as if the whole work is removing the plank. But note how Jesus says that once the plank is removed, then we can go help the brother with his speck. And does God want us to help other people with their sin? Yes. But only after we've done a great deal of work mortifying our own sin that we can be usefully used in that capacity. And guys, finally, and again, I would kind of put this at the same stage. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." What is the mark when we have really begun to put sin to death? Guys, it's when, first of all, we stand out from the world. When we are sheep among wolves. When we are light among darkness. And guess what? The darkness didn't like the light when Jesus was shining. The darkness won't like the light when we are shining. You're not going to meet a wolf that is content just to leave a lamb to happily graze in the pasture. When you begin to grow in holiness, there will come persecution. But that is something that we should not fear, but rather it's a mark that God has done an extraordinary work in our lives. Let me just leave you with a verse. This is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind." And catch this. "For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." Guys, when we begin to be willing to suffer for righteousness' sake, it's a sign that a mighty victory is beginning to be won over sin. Guys, we'll have one last session on how to put sin to death. In that last session, we're going to think very practically. How do you actually fit this discipline or the disciplines that go into this labor into the schedule, the routine of an ordinary life? May God give you great grace, give you great wisdom, and grant you victory in the fight against sin.